Las Vegas, October 12, 1975. Elvis heard someone singing backstage during intermission and stopped in his tracks. It was the janitor, cleaning the hallway, singing opera with a voice that sounded like it belonged at the Met. What Elvis did next transformed a 62-year-old cleaning man into an overnight sensation and proved that talent has no uniform. Subscribe to Elvis Presley Legacy Stories for moments when the king reminded us that greatness can be found in the most unexpected places. The International Hotel was bustling that Saturday evening as Elvis prepared for his second show of the night. The first performance had been spectacular, leaving the audience wanting more, and Elvis was energized, pacing the backstage corridors during the 20-minute intermission while the crew reset the stage. Charlie Hodge was with him, discussing the set list for the second show, when Elvis suddenly held up his hand. "Wait, you hear that?" Charlie stopped talking and listened. At first, he heard nothing unusual, just the typical backstage sounds of equipment being moved, crew members talking, the distant hum of the audience returning to their seats. Then he heard it too. Someone was singing. Not just singing, but producing sounds of such purity and power that it seemed impossible they were coming from somewhere in the utilitarian backstage corridors. But what Elvis didn't know yet was the voice belonged to someone the Vegas entertainment world had completely overlooked for decades. Thomas Anderson was 62 years old and had worked as a janitor at the International Hotel for 7 years. Every night he cleaned the backstage areas, the dressing rooms, the hallways where stars walked. He had seen every major entertainer who performed in Vegas, but none of them had ever really seen him. What nobody at the hotel knew was that Thomas had trained at Juilliard in the 1930s, one of the first black students accepted to the prestigious music school. He had studied opera, mastered multiple languages, and dreamed of performing at the world's greatest opera houses. But the world of the 1930s and 1940s wasn't ready for a black opera singer. Every audition ended the same way. You have remarkable talent, but the "but" always meant the same thing. Doors stayed closed, no matter how beautifully he sang. By 1950, Thomas had given up on his dreams. He married, had 3 children, worked whatever jobs he could find to support his family. When his wife died in 1968, he moved to Las Vegas, took the janitor job, and resigned himself to cleaning the stages where others lived his dream. Wait until you see what happened next. Elvis followed the sound, like a man in a trance, Charlie hurrying to keep up. They turned a corner and found Thomas in a backstage hallway, mop in hand, bucket beside him, singing Puccini's Nessun Dorma in perfect Italian while he cleaned. Thomas's eyes were closed, lost in the music, unaware he had an audience. His voice filled the hallway with such beauty that Elvis felt chills run down his spine. This wasn't good singing. This was transcendent singing, the kind that comes from decades of training and a lifetime of unexpressed passion. The song reached its climactic moment. Vincerò! 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 Thomas's voice soared to the high notes with such power and precision that several crew members had stopped working to listen. Elvis stood motionless until Thomas finished, the final note hanging in the air like a prayer. Only then did Thomas open his eyes and realize he had an audience. His face immediately showed embarrassment and fear. "I'm sorry, Mr. Presley, sir. I didn't mean to disturb anyone. I'll be quiet now. You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet." Elvis walked closer, his expression intense. "How long have you been singing like that?" Thomas looked at his mop, ashamed. "Most of my life, sir, but I should be working, not making noise. I'm sorry." "Sorry?" Elvis's voice rose with disbelief. "Man, you've got one of the most beautiful voices I've ever heard. Where did you learn to sing opera?" Thomas hesitated, decades of rejection making him reluctant to share his story. But something about Elvis's genuine interest made the words come out. "Juilliard, sir. Class of 1935. But that was a long time ago." Elvis stared at him. "You trained at Juilliard and you're working as a janitor?" "Times were different back then for people like me," Thomas said quietly. "Doors didn't open, no matter how hard I knocked. Don't miss this crucial detail." Elvis was silent for a long moment, and those who knew him could see his mind working. Then he turned to Charlie Hodge. "How much time before the second show starts?" Charlie checked his watch. "About 12 minutes. Elvis turned back to Thomas. "What's your name, sir?" "Thomas Anderson, Mr. Presley." "Thomas, I need to ask you something, and I need you to say yes. Will you come out on stage with me tonight and sing for the audience?" Thomas's face went white. "Mr. Presley, I couldn't possibly. I'm just a janitor. I'm not dressed properly. I haven't performed in front of people in 40 years. Thomas," Elvis interrupted gently but firmly, "I've been performing for 20 years. I've sung with some of the greatest voices in the world, and what I just heard in this hallway is better than most of them. Those people out there deserve to hear you. The question is, do you have the courage to let them?" What you're about to witness will blow your mind. Think about this for a moment. If you had a gift you'd hidden for 40 years because the world told you it didn't want it, would you have the courage to share it again if someone finally asked? Would you risk the vulnerability of trying after decades of rejection? Thomas stood there, mop still in hand, facing the biggest decision of his life. Elvis waited patiently, not pushing, just offering an opportunity. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice shaking. "Yes, sir, I'll do it." Elvis's security team quickly found Thomas a proper suit from wardrobe, and while Thomas changed, Elvis went on stage and addressed the confused audience who had been waiting for the show to resume. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to tell you about something that just happened backstage. I was walking around during intermission when I heard the most beautiful voice I've heard in my entire career. When I found out where it was coming from, I learned something that reminded me why I love music so much." The audience was captivated, leaning forward in their seats. That voice belonged to a 62-year-old man named Thomas Anderson, who's been cleaning this hotel for 7 years. He trained at Juilliard 4 decades ago, but the world back then wouldn't give him a chance because of the color of his skin. He's been pushing a mop while carrying one of the finest voices in America inside him. That's when the real magic began. Well, tonight that changes. I've invited Thomas to come out here and share his gift with all of you, and I want you to give him the respect and attention he should have received 40 years ago. Can you do that for me? The audience erupted in applause. Many already moved to tears by the story before they'd even heard Thomas sing. Elvis gestured to the wings. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Thomas Anderson." Thomas walked onto the stage in a borrowed suit that was slightly too big, his hands shaking, his face showing both terror and hope. The spotlight hit him, and 2,000 people gave him a standing ovation before he'd sung a single note. Elvis put his arm around Thomas's shoulders and spoke quietly, so only Thomas could hear. "You've got this. Just sing like you were singing in that hallway. Pretend it's just you and the music." Elvis handed Thomas the microphone and stepped back, giving him the stage. Thomas stood there for a moment, overwhelmed. Then he closed his eyes, just as he had in the hallway, and began to sing. He sang Nessun Dorma again, the same Puccini aria, but this time with the power of the International Hotel's sound system behind him. His voice filled the massive showroom with such beauty that people forgot to breathe. The audience sat in stunned silence, experiencing something none of them had expected when they came to see Elvis. This wasn't rock and roll. This wasn't entertainment. This was art at its highest form, delivered by someone they would have walked past without a second glance. What came next changed everything. When Thomas reached the climactic Vincero, his voice soared to notes that seemed impossible for a 62-year-old man who hadn't performed in decades. The power, the precision, the emotion, it was all there, preserved through years of cleaning floors and dreaming of stages. The final note hung in the air, and for a moment, the showroom was completely silent. Then, the audience exploded. People weren't just applauding, they were screaming, crying, standing, waving. The ovation lasted for 7 full minutes, and Thomas stood on that stage with tears streaming down his face, experiencing what he thought he'd lost forever. Elvis walked over and embraced him. "You just showed them all," Elvis said into his ear. "Every door that closed on you was wrong. Hold on. This story has an incredible continuation. What happened in the next 24 hours was unprecedented in Vegas entertainment history. Word of Thomas Anderson's performance spread through the hotel like wildfire. By morning, every major newspaper in Las Vegas had the story on the front page. By afternoon, network television news was covering it nationally. The phone at the International Hotel's main desk rang constantly with booking requests. Opera companies, concert promoters, recording studios, everyone wanted Thomas Anderson. The janitor who had been invisible for 7 years was suddenly the most sought-after talent in America. But Elvis wasn't done helping Thomas. Behind the scenes, he used his connections to ensure Thomas wasn't exploited by agents looking to make quick money off his sudden fame. You need to know this incredible detail. Elvis personally called several entertainment lawyers, explaining Thomas's situation and asking them to help protect him from predatory contracts. He connected Thomas with a reputable manager who specialized in classical music. He made sure Thomas understood his worth and didn't settle for less than he deserved. Most importantly, Elvis insisted that Thomas be paid for that night's performance, not a token amount, but the same fee a featured guest performer would receive. When hotel management balked, Elvis threatened threatened to not perform his remaining scheduled shows unless Thomas was compensated properly. Thomas received a check for $15,000 for singing one song, more money than he'd made in the previous year as a janitor. Within a week, Thomas had been offered contracts with 3 major opera companies: the Metropolitan Opera in New York, the San Francisco Opera, and the Lyric Opera of Chicago. All wanted him for their upcoming seasons. At 62, Thomas Anderson finally made his professional opera debut, singing the role of the Emperor in Puccini's Turandot at the San Francisco Opera in December 1975. Critics called it one of the most powerful performances they'd seen in years. Mr. Anderson's voice carries the weight of a lifetime of experience, wrote the San Francisco Chronicle's music critic. He sings not just with technical precision, but with a depth of emotion that can only come from knowing what it means to have your dreams deferred. Thomas performed professionally for the next 12 years, appearing at major opera houses across America and Europe. He finally sang at the Metropolitan Opera at age 67, fulfilling the dream he'd carried since his Juilliard days. But the most touching moment was still to come. In June 1977, just 2 months before Elvis died, Thomas was invited to perform at a special charity concert at Graceland. Elvis, whose health was declining, insisted on attending. After Thomas performed, Elvis invited him to sit in the Jungle Room, Elvis's favorite space at Graceland. They talked for hours about music, dreams, second chances, and what it means to finally be seen. "You gave me my life back," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "For 40 years, I felt like I'd wasted my gift. You showed me it was never wasted, just waiting for the right moment." Elvis, looking tired but peaceful, replied, "Thomas, you had that gift all along. I just helped you find a stage big enough for it. But here's what you taught me. Talent doesn't expire, dreams don't die, and it's never too late to become who you were meant to be." It was one of the last meaningful conversations Elvis had before his death 2 months later. Wait until you hear what happened after. When Elvis died in August 1977, Thomas Anderson was performing in La Boheme at the Los Angeles Opera. He learned of Elvis's death between acts and dedicated his final performance to the man who gave me back my voice and my dignity. At Elvis's funeral, Priscilla Presley personally invited Thomas to sing. He performed Ave Maria at Graceland, his voice carrying across the estate as thousands of mourners stood in silence. It was the same song he had sung at his Juilliard graduation in 1935, and now he was singing it for the man who had finally given him the career that education had promised. Thomas Anderson continued performing until 1987, when he retired at age 74. He spent his final years teaching opera at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where he established a scholarship fund for talented students from disadvantaged backgrounds. "I don't want anyone else to spend 40 years cleaning floors when they should be performing," Thomas said when announcing the scholarship. "Elvis taught me that talent deserves to be recognized regardless of circumstance. I'm just passing that lesson forward." Incredible revelation coming up. The story of Elvis and Thomas Anderson had ripple effects throughout the entertainment industry. It sparked conversations about ageism and performing arts, about second chances, about how much talent goes unrecognized because it doesn't fit conventional expectations. Several major venues began implementing programs to discover hidden talent among their staff. The Thomas Anderson Initiative became common in entertainment companies, encouraging employees to share their talents and providing pathways from behind-the-scenes work to performance opportunities. The International Hotel, where it all began, established an annual Hidden Talent Showcase where any hotel employee could audition. Several successful performers were discovered through this program over the years, including a housekeeping supervisor who became a successful country music singer and a parking attendant who became a stand-up comedian. If you worked a job where your talents went unrecognized, would you have the courage to share them if given the chance? Or would years of rejection and routine have convinced you to keep your gifts hidden? In 1988, CBS produced a documentary called Nessun Dorma, the Thomas Anderson Story, which told the full tale of his journey from Juilliard to janitor to opera star. The documentary featured interviews with Elvis's former band members, Thomas's colleagues from the hotel, opera critics, and civil rights historians who provided context about the racial barriers Thomas had faced. The documentary won an Emmy and was credited with inspiring thousands of older adults to pursue dreams they'd abandoned. Community colleges across America reported increased enrollment in music and arts programs from students over 50, many citing Thomas's story as their inspiration. Charlie Hodge, in his interview for the documentary, shared a detail that hadn't been public before. After that night, Elvis made a point of talking to everyone who worked behind the scenes at his shows: janitors, stagehands, security guards, everyone. He'd ask them about their dreams dreams, their talents, what they wished they could do. He never wanted to overlook another Thomas Anderson. Thomas Anderson passed away in 2003 at age 90, having lived to see his story inspire a generation. His obituary in the New York Times called him the janitor who became an opera star and reminded America that talent has no expiration date. At his memorial service, recordings of his performances were played, including that first night in Las Vegas when Elvis brought him on stage. Many in attendance said you could still hear the emotion in Thomas's voice, the joy of finally being heard, the pain of years of silence, the triumph of dreams finally fulfilled. His 3 children spoke about how their father's life changed after that October night in 1975. For 40 years, we watched our father carry this gift inside him with nowhere to share it, his daughter Maria said. Elvis Presley gave him the gift of being seen. That's something you can't put a price on. The Thomas Anderson Scholarship at UNLV continues to this day, having helped over 500 students pursue music education. Each scholarship recipient is required to perform at a community event for free at least once per year, passing forward the gift of accessibility to music that Thomas received that night from Elvis. The International Hotel, now the Westgate, has a permanent exhibit about that October night, featuring Thomas's janitor uniform displayed next to the borrowed suit he wore on stage. The exhibit is titled Hidden in Plain Sight, When the King Found a Voice. Visitors often stop at the exhibit and share their own stories of hidden talents and deferred dreams. The comment book is filled with entries from people who were inspired by Thomas's story to finally pursue their passions, regardless of age or circumstance. One entry, written in 2019, reads, "I'm 58 years old and just enrolled in art school because of this story. If Thomas could start an opera career at 62, I can start painting at 58. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Elvis." Here's something most people don't know. The mop and bucket Thomas was using when Elvis found him were preserved by the hotel. They sit in storage, occasionally displayed for special events, a reminder that greatness often looks ordinary until someone takes the time to really listen. The story of Elvis and Thomas Anderson teaches us several profound lessons. First, it reminds us that talent doesn't expire and dreams don't die. They just wait for the right moment and the right person to recognize them. Second, it shows us the power of using our platforms to elevate others. Elvis could have simply complimented Thomas privately and moved on. Instead, he used his stage, his influence, and his connections to change a man's life completely. Third, it demonstrates that we never know what gifts the people around us are carrying. The person cleaning your office, serving your coffee, or parking your car might be carrying extraordinary talents that the world has never seen. What would happen if we all looked at people the way Elvis looked at Thomas, not just seeing what they do, but wondering what they could do? How many Thomas Andersons are around us right now, waiting for someone to listen? How many gifts go unshared because no one has offered a stage? Almost 50 years later, people still talk about the night Elvis Presley turned a janitor into an opera star. It wasn't just a feel-good moment, it was a demonstration of how recognition and opportunity can transform lives. In a world that often judges people by their jobs, their age, or their circumstances, this story reminds us that greatness isn't defined by uniform or title. It's defined by gift, and gifts deserve to be shared regardless of who carries them. Thomas Anderson spent 40 years believing the world had rejected his gift. Elvis Presley spent one evening proving the world had just been too deaf to hear it. The difference between those two realities was simply one person willing to stop, listen, and offer a stage. That's why this story matters. It reminds us that sometimes the most important thing we can do is pay attention to the people everyone else overlooks, because the next Thomas Anderson might be closer than we think. Thomas Anderson's late career success opened doors for other opera singers who had faced similar barriers. The major opera houses that had once turned away talented black performers began actively recruiting diverse talent, recognizing that they had been missing extraordinary voices for decades. By 1980, the Metropolitan Opera had tripled its number of black performers, and artistic directors across the country cited Thomas's story as a wake-up call. "We realized we had been looking for talent in the same places while ignoring entire communities of gifted artists," said one Met director in a 1982 interview. The Juilliard School established the Thomas Anderson Fellowship in 1978, specifically for talented students from underrepresented backgrounds. The fellowship covered full tuition plus living expenses, ensuring that financial barriers wouldn't prevent the next generation from pursuing their dreams. To date, over 200 students have received the Thomas Anderson Fellowship, many going on to successful careers in opera, musical theater, and classical music. At each year's fellowship ceremony, a recording of Thomas's first performance with Elvis is played, reminding students that talent can survive decades of being overlooked and still flourish when given the chance. In private interviews conducted before his death, Thomas spoke candidly about the psychological toll of carrying unexpressed talent for 40 years. "Every day I cleaned those stages, I died a little inside," he admitted. "I'd hear performers who weren't as technically skilled as I was, and I'd feel angry, then ashamed for feeling angry, then depressed that I was wasting my life." Thomas sought therapy in the 1960s for what would now be recognized as depression. "The therapist told me I needed to let go of my dreams and accept my reality," Thomas recalled. "I tried. I really tried to kill that part of myself that wanted to sing. But you can't kill a gift. It just goes dormant, waiting." His experience highlighted an often overlooked aspect of systemic discrimination, the internal damage caused by having your gifts rejected repeatedly until you learn to reject them yourself. Mental health professionals who studied Thomas's case in later years used it as an example of how societal barriers can create lasting psychological wounds. "Thomas Anderson's story isn't just about talent being discovered late," wrote Dr. Patricia Morrison in the Journal of Music Psychology. "It's about the profound psychological harm caused when people are forced to bury their authentic selves for decades. His depression, his sense of wasted life, his struggle to accept his circumstances, these are all natural responses to an unnatural situation." After Thomas's discovery, dozens of international hotel employees came forward with their own stories of hidden talents and deferred dreams. The hotel's human resources department was flooded with requests from workers who wanted opportunities to demonstrate abilities that had nothing to do with their job descriptions. A housekeeper revealed she was a published poet. A security guard disclosed he was a trained classical pianist. A line cook admitted he had a degree in fine arts. The hotel, inspired by Elvis's example, created an employee talent showcase that became an annual event, giving workers a platform to share gifts that their daily jobs didn't require. Elvis showed us that every person working here had a whole life, whole dreams, whole talents that we knew nothing about, said the hotel's director of human resources. "We'd been seeing people as their job titles instead of as complete human beings. That was our failure, not theirs." Several employees who participated in the talent showcases went on to second careers or side businesses that brought them fulfillment beyond their primary jobs. While not everyone became a star like Thomas, the act of being seen and acknowledged for their complete selves had profound impacts on morale and life satisfaction. One of the most treasured recordings in the Elvis archives is the audio from that October night when Thomas first performed. The International Hotel's sound engineer, Rick Martinez, almost didn't record it. "I was on break when Elvis brought Thomas on stage," Martinez recalled years later. "My colleague radioed me urgently saying I needed to get back to the booth immediately because something incredible was happening. I ran back and started recording about 30 seconds into Thomas's performance. If I'd been another minute later, we wouldn't have that recording." That recording became the basis for Thomas's first professional album, Late Bloomer, released in 1976. The album featured both the original live recording from Vegas and studio recordings of Thomas performing classic opera arias. It was nominated for a Grammy and introduced classical music to audiences who might never have discovered it otherwise. "I bought that album because I loved Elvis and wanted to hear the story," wrote one Amazon reviewer in 2015. "I stayed because Thomas Anderson's voice is absolutely stunning. I've since become a huge opera fan, all because of a janitor who got discovered at 62. That's the power of taking chances on people." That October night in 1975, Elvis Presley proved that being the king of rock and roll meant using your crown to crown others. He showed us that the most beautiful performances aren't always our own, and that sometimes the greatest thing we can do with a spotlight is shine it on someone who's been standing in darkness for too long. Thomas Anderson came to work that night thinking he'd clean another stage where others lived their dreams. He left, having finally lived his own, proving that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. If this story moved you, look around at the people in your life whose talents you might be overlooking. Ask the question Elvis asked, what gifts are you carrying that the world hasn't heard yet? Subscribe to Elvis Presley Legacy Stories to discover more. Moments when the King showed us that true royalty is measured by how many lives we elevate, not how high we stand. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that their dreams aren't dead. They're just waiting for someone to listen, because that's what real kings do.